You remember Len Sweet. It's been a while since you've seen him, but
Yeah.
Thank you. I remember you. Good to see you.
So we are live on Facebook.
All right.
So here we go.
Pop us up on our, hang on. Make sure I'm here. Here we are. All right. All right. So, hey, we're so glad to be here on Faith on Friday. We're so glad for everybody. I know you'll be jumping in. And we have a special guest today. If this is your first time in, I'm Chip Freed, the lead teaching pastor at Garfield Memorial Church in Greater Cleveland. My wife, Terry Freed, my ministry teammate, and also our executive pastor and my best friend in ministry, Terry McHugh, our executive pastor. We're here and we are welcoming a very special guest, no stranger to us, but maybe to some of you jumping in. Dr. Leonard Sweet is an amazing voice in Christ Church and open ears to what the Holy Spirit is doing. And I wanted to introduce him to Greater Cleveland. And I was thinking about this, Len, how do we introduce you? You say author, speaker, teacher, seminary dean. I know you get futurist a lot. I like that one. Some people kind of seem like use that in vain, but most of the time it's a compliment. But we were talking before we jumped on something that Len didn't know about me maybe as much as a real avid fisherman. And I got to tell you, this is kind of a way of thank you to you from me for the impact you've had on my journey the last 3 decades. But also where I've kind of honed in on my favorite title for you is being a nutty fisherman. I was actually a licensed guide in Quebec when I was 14 years old. There's a long story with that. But I've guided people into the Northwest Territories and other locations. And for me, you've just been a spiritual guide. I ball taking people in on fishing, showing them things. And hey, have you thought of that? And for at least for 3 decades of my wife and I's ministry together, you've been a real reliable spiritual guide. I emailed you and talked about Lewis and Clark and Sacagawea. It's like been out there, hey, the water's running a little fast. There may be a waterfall ahead. Hey, the moss is only growing on one side of the tree. I just want to thank you and appreciate all you've done. And it just really was excited to get a chance to talk to you with what's going on in our world that I think you anticipated more than most. Not maybe the specifics, but just a sense of that. And so welcome to Greater Cleveland, Len.
Well, thank you, Jeb. I just see myself as a lover of Jesus, so it's really that simple for me. So.
Well, good. And a listener to the Holy Spirit, I'll say that, which is the active voice of Jesus speaking right now. So, hey, chance to, I was laughing a little bit. I thought I read every book you ever had. Was it Henry Nouwen that said they never had an unpublished thought? Was he the one or was it somebody else? Somebody said that.
Yeah, a lot of people have said it, but yes.
So, but really appreciate the words in that. I guess I just want to kind of start off because I know we only have you for an hour and we look forward to having you come here to Cleveland with us in the not too distant future as well. And maybe we'll do this again by this forum. But 2020 is off to such an inauspicious start, right? So, in the midst of this new decade, I just was really interested to hear from you as a guide for me and all of us as people of faith. What are you hearing from God right now? What are you kind of sensing? I know you're writing some new stuff, but as all of this has kind of been unveiled at the beginning of this year, what are you sensing? What would you say to us as people of faith?
Well, the first thing is that we are here by divine appointment, and it's hard for us to hear this and receive this, but this is not the time I would have chosen. I'm totally unprepared for this time. I'm not been trained for this time, but you don't get to pick your moment. And in the divine providence and sovereignty of God, God has chosen and appointed me and you and all of us here for such a time as this. And so we have to, Charles Wesley's to serve this present age, our calling to fulfill. It's not the age I would have picked. If you come into my home, I don't live in this age. I live in the Victorian era. you step into a time warp, you know. If I could live anytime, it'd be, you know, about 1870 maybe. But you don't get to pick your moment. And you get to pick your furniture, but you don't get to pick your moment. And so this is our moment. And for some reason, God thinks that all of us have something to contribute to this moment. And so I got to trust God here. And there's Tolkien does this in Lord of the Rings really well. He has a conversation where Frodo says, I don't know if you remember, I wish the ring had never come to me. I wish none of this had happened. And then Gandalf replies, so do all who live to see such times, but that is not for them to decide. All you have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to you. And so I start with that, that we've either got to live our moment or say, you know, I'm not going to live this moment. I'll just freeze time and live someplace else, which is to escape, not to engage missionally with the world that God has given us. So I just think it's good to start there, that we're here by divine appointment, that that we were made for this moment. And even though none of us feel, at least I don't, qualified for this, prepared for this, or even want this, the point is to what are we going to do with the time that God has given us? And so we've got pandemics, plagues, we got recessions, we got racism, we got all this stuff. How do we deal with this moment that God has given us?
So what are some of those answers to Gandalf's questions that you're sensing? What, like, it's what we do in it, I guess. What's some of the you're leading there?
Yeah. Well, one of the things I think that one of the things that God is doing is God is doing a new thing, and it's hard for us to appreciate that as well, because we think, well, we'll get, only if we just wait long enough, we'll get back to normal. And there is no back to normal after this.
Right.
The normal is gone, and there's no more business as usual. And when you have a paradigm shift like this, things go back to zero. They don't go back to any normal. They start over. And so we need to hear kind of Isaiah, 43 again. Behold, I do a new thing. Do you not perceive it? And so what is the new thing that God is up to that we can join and be a part of? So I'm seeing a whole new thing that I think is being born. And if we're going to cling to the past and mourn the past and just keep looking back, the pillar of salt that Lot's wife left, it's really a symbol of, she cried herself to death. I mean, tears are salt. And she cried herself to death because she kept yearning for what was in the past and what was no more. And why can't we go back to that? And why can't we have that and bring that with us? And no, God's doing a new thing. And so we got to open our eyes, not to keep crying, but to see what God is doing and to get excited about it. So that's kind of my excitement as well.
It's kind of interesting. I something I preached on way back, and I want to hear your words more than mine. But Luke kind of picks up on that thread when he talks about what the kingdom of God is like somebody sitting up on the top of a house, and Jesus calls. He says, "Oh, let me go get my stuff in order." And no, jump down and follow. And then Jesus said in 3 little words, "Remember Lot's wife." Like, just threw it up there out of nowhere. And the way you just kind of shared that was really, really helpful. And I know you wrote in your last book that we're going to talk a little bit about, but more on a book that really has made an impact at Garfield in deep, deep ways. But in your most recent one, Rings of Fire, you said something, the temptation of the church of the future will be to escape, not engage. So that kind of sounds like that's a temptation. Right. Get out of this deal. We didn't choose it, but you're calling us to engage. Yeah. So what are some ways we as followers are, individually and collectively, I don't know, what are some engaging points that you're sensing that God's leading us to? Points of engagement, I guess. Yeah, well, there's so many of them that we can talk about a couple just to be conscious of a couple things. One is that in this
pandemic pandemonium, there are certain winners and losers, and one of the winners is gardening. I mean, we are all outdoor activities now are booming, especially home outdoor activities and gardening. I mean, you tried to get some gardening seeds recently. I mean, there's you can't. I mean, gardening is huge. Camping supplies are huge. Seeds are skyrocketing, and so I really think Christianity began as an out-of-doors religion. It did not begin indoors. It did not have indoors rituals. It really it began out of doors. The rituals that we did have took place out of doors, often around tables out of doors. And the world's oldest profession is not what we think it is. I mean, the first commandment is tend and till the garden. God created Adam to be a gardener. And so I think it's returning us somewhat to our initial calling to understand that God's mission is in the world. It's out of doors. It's not within walls and buildings and to define the church as a building I think is gone forever. So I think there's a returning us to the rebooting of the church, kind of the detoxifying it, the defragging of it. So I think there's a lot going on here as we understand what the initial human was called to do, and Jesus is the last Adam. I mean, his mission is complete because he returns us to the garden that we've been expelled from. And what's Jesus's first sign? What's the sign that his mission is complete? Well, who's the first person he appears to? Mary. Does she recognize him? No. Who does she think he is? The gardener. So we're back in the garden, and maybe it's time for the church to get back to the garden. Maybe it's the time for the church to garden again. I mean, it has bothered me so bad, Chip, that our churches, I mean, all we do are lawns. I mean, have you ever seen a garden in a church? Or why can't we turn our lawns into gardens? I don't care whether they're flower gardens or vegetable gardens or why, what is this? And why haven't our churches been bird sanctuaries and insectoriums and places, wildlife corridors that connect with other churches? I mean, we could have done so much here for the environment and to be faithful to our first commandment, tend and till the garden, conserve what I've created and continue my creativity. And we have not done that. And so I think we're being returned to a sensitivity to where we began. And I think that's for the good. Yeah,
well, it's tough to interview when you're taking so many notes here. Rebooting, detoxifying, defrag. I forget which poet it is. I wasn't ready for this, but Death thought he was an executioner, but the gospel turned him into a gardener.
Exactly.
Yeah, like that is that's some awesome stuff.
Jesus, he's supposed to have been a carpenter. It wasn't a carpenter because that's tecton doesn't mean carpenter, right. Craftsman, artisan. And how many trees you see over there? I mean, come on. But it really, he had the imagination of a gardener. All of his stories are gardening stories. I mean, so he's the last Adam, and he's continuing that gardening imagination. And that's kind of when I write books, I see myself gardening with words on my computer. My computer is my field, and I'm planting seeds, and I'm playing in the ground, and so I think it's a really productive and fertile image for all of us to see. Even raising our kids, we're gardening. We don't own it. We're gardening. We're gardening to grow these trusts, these plants that God has given us into what God made them to be. So we've done too much of the old stuff for so long. The leadership stuff and all of the mechanistic stuff. It's time for us to get more organic, more natural, and return to our origins. That's where true originality is. It's a return to origins. Originality is from the original, is from the origins.
Our current teaching series is called Planted. You know,
Cool.
Paul planted, Apollos watered, God brought the harvest. So not, you're right. It just, the Holy Spirit's so good. And I was, thinking around that. I'm going to share my screen real quick. We were talking about this off screen, but I don't want this to be more about you. These are the books that kind of, were really, his most recent one is Rings of Fire. He's got more in the works. This Tablet to Table, if I don't spend a good amount talking about that, Garfield will throw rocks at me, stuff out of the garden. But I had shared with you off screen that this is what I had said to our church, our leadership, toward the end of last quarter. I sensed that 2020 was going to set off the most important decade. These are literally out of our church minutes in the American church since at least the civil rights movement and possibly since the Great Awakening. I think that was just the trends we were seeing and talking about. I didn't even know where Wuhan, China was. Obviously, my wife and I, as an interracial couple who've lived through all, we first got together in the 80s, only 10% of America was in favor of that. So, we're aware of the race crisis, and I had the privilege to study under Manning Marable and be a graduate assistant for Cornell West. But still, again, that while we were seated, while God had our attention, we were observing the horror of what you even call our nation's original sin too. But you wrote these words, which I just loved. You said, and this was in Rings of Fire, current times, you called something out, but will call for the most creative evangelism and shrewd apologetics the church has seen since the first century. I mean, you said that in 19, it was published in 19. If ever the time is right for, here we are, garden, right? Tilling, planting, and watering the soil is now. But best not to underestimate the challenge. And then this one just really got at me. But we may be the least formed and worst prepared generation of Jesus' disciples in history, facing the greatest challenges the church has ever faced. That just cut into me today, like just prophetic that you were sharing out of that sensing. This is way before what developed in 2020. I don't know. Can you talk about that aspect of you were sensing as well? There's this stirring of this great challenge, and you list so much of it in the book. And I commend all of Dr. Sweet's books. And really, I was in Rings of Fire today, and Dr. Sweet, Len asked me if I had a headache. I do, a spiritual headache, it's the best kind. But you were sensing something, and you were also sensing, like, we have really come out of the chute. Post Easter, we did 12 weeks on putting on your spiritual PPE from Ephesians 6. Like, just what do we have to put on? Because I think the people of God, the disciples of Christ, we got to be ready for an important work now and beyond this. And now we're in this Planet series from my friend Daniel M., who you may know from Lifeway. He came into one of these up from Edmonton, and I'm laughing. He was saying, I got nothing to do, so I'm doing these garden boxes. So I got to tell him our conversation today. But he wrote a book, No Silver Bullets, for Lifeway, about what are those things we need to input to yield output in discipleship. So we're doing a lot of preparing. In a sense, when you wrote those words, guess what I'm sensing too? We may not, because of how we've done church, lawns instead of bird sanctuaries, and that's just an image, that we may be ill prepared for this moment, that we better dig down deep in our roots. So talk to me about that kind of what made you write that, and help us.
Well, let me just say, when I wrote that sentence, I just had to sit still for a minute, and I just shuddered, because I really felt the impact of those words. And then I just said, those words do not even convey how bad the situation is. And they underestimate it. And partly, I mean, we spent the last 30 years not talking about Jesus or Christ formation, or what does it mean that Christ wants to live his resurrection life in and through us. We've been talking about apps. We've been talking happy apps, how to have a happy marriage, how to have a happy this, how to do this better. I mean, it's been all very happy. And so all of a sudden we are faced with an enormous, that's shaking us at our roots, and we have no roots. And we've been, you could have, and I haven't done it recently, but before the pandemic, I had my students just routinely monitor the top 20 kind of online sermons watched the previous week. And for some of them, I just gave them the challenge. How many times was Jesus referenced rhetorically, or how many times was Jesus referenced in a substantive way that focused on what does it mean for Christ to form in us? And most of them, they couldn't, Jesus was hardly ever mentioned at all. If he was mentioned, he was mentioned rhetorically, but very few mentioned what does it mean to live the life of Christ, and that Christ wants to form in us. And he's at two places at once. He's at the right hand of the Father interceding for us. But at the same time, it's good that I go away, because I'm going to send you my Spirit, because I'm going to live my resurrection life in and through you, so that everything that I do, you can do. And, and oops, has nobody read that? And no, let's talk about being a better leader, how to surround yourself with the people that make you look good. Oh, that's what Jesus did with those 12 disciples. He surrounded himself with people that really made him look good. I mean, so we are totally unprepared for this. And so it, now, again, God called us all here for this moment. It's not too late for any of us, but one of the first things we have to do is we've got a people racked in fear, and facts and data don't matter when you're totally shell shocked in fear. And when you're shell shocked in fear, you just can't think for yourself, and you can't think even God thoughts. You're just being bandied about by what everybody's saying, and so we've got to put on the mind of Christ. I mean, that is so important here, is that we've got to rediscover Jesus, who he is. What does it mean that we're putting on the mind of Christ? And what does it mean that we are living the life of Christ? Now, the more Jesus lives in me, the more unique and one of a kind I become, and different I become, not the same to you, the different I become from you. But that whole issue of being prepared, preparedness is huge. You cannot, and Chip, our church loves planning. We have these strategic plans and 5-year plans and 3-year plans, and Jesus didn't have a 3-year plan for his ministry. I mean, and there's no strategic plan in the world that had 9/11, the collapse of the Soviet Union, COVID-19. I mean, we are living in a world where anything can happen and probably will. The only thing you can plan for is that, as I say in the book, wild cards and black swans will happen. In fact, the illustration of that, I said in the book, the Rings of Fire book, that I can guarantee you, this is my illustration of a black swan, that China will catch a virus and it will sneeze and the whole world will come down with it. And I had no idea. I was just using it as an illustration of what a black swan was, and I had no idea. And a few months after the book was published, that was exactly what happened. So you can't plan for that kind of, you can only be prepared. And preparedness comes for putting on the mind of Christ and just letting him be the North Star, and he becomes our coordinates. And so.
Well, it's interesting because I want to pivot this a little bit, and Terry McHugh, if you can talk to folk online if they've got some questions or comments. But when you went from Faith Quakes to Soul Tsunami to Ring of Fire, it seems like you again that work of spiritual guide, as I've said. And if you guys are just jumping in with us, we're here with Leonard Sweet, who's been just a real pivotal guide for me in my 30-year journey. But your sense, trying to find the compass, the GPS off the map, which you were just talking, reminds me a little bit of stuff you were rocking in Jesus Manifesto. Like, we got to get back to, living that, rediscovering what it really means to be a follower of Christ, which means he sends us out to be representatives of him in the world. And, reading that little comment of yours, we may be really ill prepared for that, because we were thinking being a Christian was something far from that.
Right. Yeah. And you got the world's a whole different world. That's the other thing. I mean, let me give you another little example. What is the number one industry in the world? It's tourism. Tourism employs more people than anybody else in the world. What has the coronavirus shut down?
Tourism.
Tourism. So the number one industry in the world has been destroyed, has been flattened. Now, if you don't think we're going to be suffering, we're going to be facing a huge depression that's going to come on the scene. I mean, I don't know what balloon juice you're sucking, but this is we are facing some horrendous challenges, and this is the world out there. So we're going to have economic recession like you wouldn't believe, and plus the world itself is no longer, hey, Christians, we love you, come here. This is not just a post-Christian culture. This is an anti-Christian culture.
Right.
So when the world sees us, is not happy to see us, and we don't understand this, and then we go get mad, and we go in our little cocoons, and we in our little shells, and we shelter, and then we get shell shocked at why does everybody hate us? Why does everybody not want to hear from us? You can't do evangelism like you did in the past. You can't, broadcast. I'm here as a Christian, and Christian's now a bad word. I mean, so it's a whole different world out there. I mean, and we are totally unprepared for ministry in that kind of a world. And let me give you just the ultimate apologetics for a post-COVID-19 world is aesthetics. It's not rational argumentation, and you still are having these Chip, what I'm talking about, these apologetics books coming in. How do you argue people and rationalize them into faith? Good luck with that. Let the beauty of Jesus be seen in me. And that's the aesthetics that has the apologetics inherent, embedded in it. And so then people go, well, what does that mean? So we don't even understand, what does it mean for the beauty of Jesus to be seen in us? Just first of all, those categories of beauty and Jesus are alien and foreign and strange, and so we are. These are the best of times, these are the worst of times, but novel occurrences require new thinking, new frameworks, new approaches. And if we don't think that this is a whole new landscape out there that hasn't been there before, and if we are not open to some new thinking and some new frameworks, jaded strategies, jaded stories, I'm so tired of old stories, they will not take us forward. We got to rethink the world. And if such rethinking and rebuilding is not enlightened and enlivened by the recognition of a transcendent reality, for us it's named Jesus, then human life will falter even more than it will, and it will continue to stumble. So it's time to rethink the church, time to rethink the world. We're in a new place. And that new place, we got to take our shoes off, because it's a sacred place.
Yeah.
It's not a scary place. It's a sacred place. And God has called us to enter that sacred place, and has given us that and said, that's your space. And so I call it an apocalyptic moment, in the sense, not doom and gloom, but maybe, if you will, boom and zoom. It's a time when we see an unveiling, apocalyptic really means revealing,
right?
Lifting back the curtain of the realms of the future that God is calling us to enter. And so it's exciting, but you've got to be ready for this.
Right.
Yeah, I really hear you talking about it as, in some ways, a gift, that we don't want to see it even as a gift,
right.
But that it really is. And we've had a few people chime in. One person said to me, it's scary, Sherry, when Dr. Sweet says we won't be going back to normal, but at the same time, it gives me hope to know God is doing a new thing. And Kathy said, "Oh, start a garden. Fresh vegetables are the best." And Barb says, "No certainties in the world, only that God will be there to help you get through anything." And we've heard a lot of that from our folks. You know, a kind of a renewed dependence on God in the midst of all this, and a return, or even a beginning of more of a prayer life or desire for that. But you know, you kind of made me think that, people tend to go, you at least used to go back and say, oh, the, good old days in the X decade, the 50s, the 60s, but those weren't really good days for people of color. Those weren't good days for women particularly. I mean, and they probably weren't good days for men in some ways, because men were, had all these stereotypes to live into. So I'm just wondering if, when we look back to, these past few decades, from the place where God is going to take us, we'll say, oh my God, we thought that was good.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that God raised us to this new level and brought us to this new place so quickly. Yeah, I think you're exactly right, Terry. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the angst in this, and Glenn, the kind of the uniqueness of our church. They claim we're the most diverse in our tribe. 1,200 active members, no one ethnic group more than 52%, which we wish was the norm in Christ Church, and I think it's going to have to be in the American church, or it's going to get let. That'll be one of the tsunamis that has been. I think God has already been forming that, and that's some of the work I don't want to dig into that we've been doing with mosaics. But that we had this time on hold, and I know with my wife, our son was profiled as a college athlete with two of his African American teammates, and we came within a whisker of losing him on that situation. And so, with the world's on hold, and then we witnessed Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, and then George Floyd, and it's like our folk of color are like, they're fearful in the sense of a new thing, but they're afraid of an old thing.
Right.
Even a global pandemic can put our, you mentioned your book, Original Sin. I've used that word. Dr. King said racism is as indigenous to America as pine trees, to use a gardening image. And so that piece is living with us. And I know you had a chapter in Ring of Fires around race relations. You saw that in the situation going out there. I don't know, as you've witnessed some of that, if there's any word you want to say to that. It's going to lead me into the table ministry in a weird way. But
yeah, well, for your tribe, you do certain things. So I publish a book every now and then for Abingdon, although I know when I do it, it will disappear. So nobody will ever see it again, but it's still my tribe, and I love these people. So, but a few years ago, I wrote a book called Me, We, and it was a book on three of the greatest dangers that I saw facing the church. And one was consumerism, and one was individualism, hence me, we. We need the individual, and the me needs we to be. It's that simple. Flip me over, you get we, and you can't be me without we. But the third one was the issue of racism. And I spent a lot of time, and I think that if we don't deal with this problem, this root cause here of racism, which is the other thing that my students know me as is I'm a semiotician. I do semiotics, which is the study and science of signs. And so everything begins with a metaphor, and the mind is made of metaphors. I mean, the biggest discovery we've had last 30 years in science has been that, we did first 30 years of my life, we explored outer space. Last 30 years, we've been exploring inner space. We've been mapping the microcircuitry of the brain. How does the brain work? How does the brain function? And the biggest discovery the last 30 years, we spent billions of dollars on this, is that your mind does not think in words. The words are the last thing that you come up with. And it's at the very end of a long process. Your mind is made of metaphors, which it turns into stories. And then those metaphors and stories become eventually words. But your mind doesn't think in words. And they spend billions of dollars to tell us something that we should have known, because whenever you dream, you never dream in words. You dream in metaphors that you turn into stories. I mean, so that's how your mind thinks. But the metaphor is wrong. We got some really bad metaphors, and until we just absolutely kill this identification of white with pure and beauty and good, and dark with evil and transgression and all that stuff. If we don't complexify, I mean, you can have good light and bad light. You can have good darkness and bad darkness. I mean, Louis Armstrong got this right. Bright, blessed day, dark, what? Sacred night. And I've been in black churches where they've been as racist in their color metaphor. You know, no, when you say make you white as snow, I want to throw up. No, roots grow into the dark so that the flower can grow into the light. But you need both darkness and light. Black is as beautiful as white. And until we get rid of this racism in our metaphors, and we dispel this image of darkness as evil and lightness as good. Now, saying we're going to get rid of racism, like saying we're going to get rid of sin. I mean, it's always going to be there, but the roots of it are right here in this, how the mind is taught to think. And if we don't just cut that, sever that, it's going to be with us. So I'm hoping that this will be a time where we'll get some. I mean, you look at the Bible, a biblical, and which I do in me, I did a biblical word study and show how the Bible talks about the treasures of darkness and the beauty of the night. And even at Christmas, you have this, holy light, holy night. You have this war of these metaphors, which is right. Well, they're both right. And light and night can be holy, and day can be holy, and dark can be holy, and light can be holy, and vice versa. So I'm hoping that as we go through this, and we need to go through this, but that we won't do it just on a superficial level. We'll actually, not on a word level, we'll get down to the real, how the brain thinks, how the mind works. And it's all metaphors of the mother, not the maid of thought. And if we don't get the metaphors right, if we don't complexify light, Lucifer was an angel of light. If we don't complexify light and complexify dark, we're in for we're just spinning our wheels.
That's a good word. And with so much we can say there, we're in this every day as we will ourselves to walk, work, and worship together as one. And we think, in that sense, it was interesting to me, because I don't want to run out of time, because I want to dig down on your book From Tablet to Table. That I don't even know if you remember handing me that thing in Chicago in 2016.
Yeah, I do.
We were sitting there.
Why did it take you 3 years to read it, Chip? I mean,
it did. I literally, actually took me 2. But you plant a seed. It goes in the ground. It was dark. No, it was. And then my wife says to me today, she said, "Well, you did get him to sign it, right?" And I went, we were just. But I don't know. I saw it and I was like, "Oh, I haven't read that one." You're like, here. And boy, I tell you, Len, that's taken on such a life. Right about when Rings of Fire was being published, we were preaching a series on. I did give you full credit. I don't do that all the time. I plagiarize. We called it From Tablet to Table from that book. We had a lot of groups that took that book and dug down deep in it. One of our campus pastors now, we're revisiting, what does that even mean? Are we really campuses, or we're just organic, or what have you? His whole calling, he talked about that at noon, is really, I think you talked about having a minister of food in that book. Like, I think his title might become, like lead table minister of our, and I'm dead serious. And we realized how crucial that was. And here was kind of my segue, because when you talked about race relations in Rings of Fire, and I don't know if you will remember going back, but you were talking about, that we need to tunnel down in the depths of our nation's original sin, to do so in no holds barred, no return address conversations, which I hope you'll be joy to your ears that, you know, we're helping this with our tribe, the Methodist Church, with Lutheran Church. We're in the Southern Baptist, through Mosaics, et cetera. We have something called multi-ethnic conversations, dig down for 8 weeks in authentic, no return address conversations. You know, when somebody starts to cry, give them the tissue. When Harvey crosses his arms, uncross his arms. When Ralph wants to leave, lock the door. You know, we do that for 8 weeks. And you know what's amazing? They end with a multi-ethnic meal. On 9. Isn't that amazing? But we've had over 700 folks just go through Garfield. And just ironically, in the last week, Garfield's going to be leading for a large group in Boise, Idaho. We have the largest Methodist church, I think 7,000 in LaCroix, Missouri, to help them start these conversations. So that's a little, I guess it was a little like, hey, Len, do you see we're doing something? I didn't mean it to be that. But then you jump in and you, in Rings of Fire, at that moment went back to From Tablet to Table. And you footnoted it and you said, the only stable existence is table existence, a direct quote from that. And you were almost leading us back, breaking those metaphors, getting in these conversations, back to the table. Right. I thought that was so amazing. And that is caught fire at Garfield. And I got to thinking, you know, you said in the book, the average parent only normally pre-COVID, you know, had a meaningful conversation with their children 38.5 times a week or minutes a week. That was per Catholic Resource Center. You know, in all the shakeup that's happening in that, you know, and it's tough with working moms. We're dealing with that. This whole, I'm praying for all our families and everywhere with this whole, you know, what do we do as we go schools? Do they open? Do they not? But you know what? In a weird way, the COVID got us back to tables.
Exactly right. No, you're exactly right. Yeah, and it's again, it's returning us back. It's rebooting the church again. It's rebooting the operating system to how we started. I mean, we started in the apostolic period, and you know, I don't have any pristine understanding of, you know, everything in the apostolic period they did right. When people start talking that way, I say, "Have you read Corinthians?"
Right.
You really read Corinthians? Just a few chapters? I mean, you got mothers sleeping with sons, and I mean, really, have you read Corinthians? But what they did do is, I mean, this is the Acts 2:42 passage. Is so they say they worship in temple. Well, wait a minute. When we hear the word worship, we hear hands up in the air, singing, pray. No, worship in temple meant they slaughtered animals. Okay, that's what worship in temple meant. So that you brought your animal for sacrifice, and then maybe you waited for the meat. But no, and then they may have heard some Levites chant psalms, but there's not any worship that we understand it. But what they did do is in the home, they gathered around the table, and these two things, if you look at it carefully, there's three things that are mentioned. There's the instruction, the apostles' teaching, there's praying, and then it says fellowship and breaking of bread together. But the breaking of the bread together and the fellowship are one. There's really, in Greek, there's no separation. There's no and. So you've got breaking of bread and fellowship, meaning the fellowship was in the breaking of bread with the whole experience bathed in prayer. And then either before, after, or during, you had the instruction in the apostles' teaching. So this is where we are now. We are back to this. I mean, we are back to this model of worship where you bring in the people in your family and in your immediate environs. And of course, they all live in multi-generational settings, but we have a multi-generational God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We don't have a one-generational God. The Bible does not think one generationally. It's multi-generationally. It thinks by definition. So we're meant to live multi-generationally. The nuclear family is not in the Bible. So you have this multi-generational meal where everybody, rich and poor, are there and eat equally. And Paul makes that clear with this horrid description of what the Corinthians were doing. And I think we're back there. There is a Spanish word, and I did not have it when I wrote Tablets to Table, and I wish I had it, Chip, and it's called sobremesa. And when I found that word, Sobremesa, mesa means table, of course. Sobra means above, over. And so I love that word, and I thought I'm gonna use that word. So I immediately went online, thought I could lock it up, and Sobremesa.com is owned by a cigar company. Okay. They sell Sobremesa cigars. I've actually bought some, and they're really good. Okay. But in Mediterranean cultures, in European cultures, even today, you would dishonor your host as a guest by, when you finish the meal, getting up. No, the meal is a prelude to what's called sobremesa time, when you sit around the table and you talk to one another and you connect with. I mean, it's hard to talk while you're eating, so you eat, and you eat well, and then and for the cigar company, you bring out the cigars, and everybody just sits around the table, and we're talking about another 45 minutes to an hour or longer, and that's when the conversation happens. And this is the standard for us. Why are we not doing sobremesa? Sobremesa, it's a meal and fellowship and conversation and relationships and singing, and sobremesa singing is common in these cultures. You know, you just start singing together and enjoying each other, and this is one of my hopes that this COVID is going to do, is to help us discover some of these rich traditions. Now there's Sobremesa, and there's Sobremesa, and sobremesa. All the other alternative sobremesa means after the meal, which means there's leftovers after the meal. And I think this is always important for Jesus, is that he always leaves leftovers. And every time that he does some miracle, I mean, look at his first miracle at Cana that introduced his mission. Okay. Who's saved? Nobody. What sermons preached? None. Who's healed? Nobody. So what's the miracle? I know it's hard for some Methodists to hear this, but he makes wine. How much wine? More than anybody could ever drink, even his disciples. I mean, you know, he could. And there's leftover. And the question, what do you do with all this leftover wine? The feeding of the 5,000, or it's really 10,000, because that's just men. So it's really sexist to do that. So you got maybe feeding of 10 to 15,000. He has leftover. He's got all these leftovers. He's always providing leftovers. So part of the sobremesa time is also, okay, we got all this rich food. Who are we going to share it with? What people are hungry and needy that we can bring it to? And so you've got this huge table tradition. And I see it when the temple is destroyed. The placement for the temple is the table. And the table becomes the new place of the centering, organizing, ordering of Jewish life and Christian life is right here at the table. And it's time for us to bring back the table.
That's funny, because honey, I don't know if you want to jump in at all, but we were just talking about that, my wife and I, today, because July's are, for whatever reason, birthdays with the Freeds. I'm the 7th, my son's the 14th, my daughter's the 28th. And my wife was just talking how refreshing it's been. You know, we get them all over, we cook, we sit, and then we have sobremesa. You know, we just I love from tablet to table that when you're like, you have a guest over, like pick something off the wall or a piece of something, and that would be here in my office. You know, we could do that. And, you know, you talked to a picture on the board of my boys and I up in Ontario, or my daughter with me out in Lake Erie, and a little picture of a thing underneath. Oh, you want the canoe story, or you want the story Dad and I were out there? And it just comes alive. And my wife was saying, you know, we need to, she even said, for we just need more of that, not just in our family, but modeling that for the community. Honey, do you want anything that was kind of on your heart about that?
Are you talking?
Yeah, like, how you were saying that we need more of that what he's talking about, that table time and modeling that. And I don't know.
We live and have lived for so many years in such, busyness, and never take that time to personally ask questions of one another and about things. And then as your parents get older, and then if you didn't take the time
Right.
when you were younger, as they get older, and you say, well, mom and dad, when did you do this? And when did you meet dad? And what was it like when you were a little girl? I look back on it, both my parents are gone. And I wish I had taken that time, instead of, I guess, considering it being selfish, and taking that time to ask them those questions that now I wish I'd have asked.
Yeah.
So being together at the table and discussing all types of subjects, but to me, this has been, and I said, in this situation which we're in, it's been some good things about it that I've seen in our family.
Yeah.
You wrote it's funny, again, this was way back before COVID, but I love, and you must feel like I feel when my kids quote my sermons back to me. I get like irritated, like, don't do that. But here I'm quoting everything you wrote. But you said, but at the table, we slow everything down from the pace of the day to enable our souls to catch up.
Yeah.
And if COVID has done something for us,
Yeah.
maybe it's just slowed it down for decades. So our souls have got a lot catching up to do.
Yeah, exactly. I think too, and this is what you said, Terry, just reminded me of this, that every child is owed its birth story. And by that, I mean, not just the basic outline of, the date you were born, but I think birthdays, if you're going to celebrate birthdays like we do, which is, this is the day I was born, give me presents. But the person who you're celebrating part of that day ought to be, tell us again your origin story, and what hospital were you born in, what time of day, how did you get there? Were you not born in, who attended you? What was the name of your doctor? Every little detail that you can remember, they are owed that. I mean, that's what we do with Jesus. We focus on the details of his story, the red heifer and the donkey and what, the manger, what was it made? All of those details are huge, and our kids are owed. And that's where they learn it, around the table. And then they kid each other about, well, when you were born, so-and-so wasn't present, what I mean? And that's where the conviviality, that's a great word, that means with, and vivial and viviality, and the coming alive around bread, and companions, the Panera with bread, and all of that. That's what builds identity. See, that's the key thing here, is that you need those stories for an identity, and we don't have an identity that's based on Christ. We try and find our identity in brands and everything else but Christ. So I'm just a real fundamentalist about this, that every child is owed their birth story in as much detail as the parents can provide it, and where they learn it and where they retell it. It's a story that never grows old, is around that table.
Well, we're getting close to time, because I want to be conscious of staying with our time for you. But I think something you begin to talk about the table in the church, and I see in here several pastors in our link and follow with us in different churches here in Ohio and elsewhere. You said in that book something that struck me: most theologians ask too much of the table in terms of theology and too little in terms of community. That it's more important that our churches have tables that are relationally correct, than liturgically correct. Now, I was funny during this pandemic, I'm doing a bunch of leadership cohorts with the Lutherans as well as our Methodists. And all of a sudden, all this talk about can we do communion online and this whole thing with the table. And you know me being ornery as I am, I'm not as articulate as you. I just said, hey, friends, that sounds like a great debate to have in like 2023. Right now, like right now, I want to minister to hurting people. Yeah. You know, and that's where we fell out. There's a great scene in a movie. It's a B movie. I don't know if you ever saw Robert Redford in The Last Castle. You know, he's a general that made a mistake and he ends up in a military prison. He owns his mistake, but he gets in there and it's almost like a, you know, like an unjust, horrible situation with a mini dictator running his prison. And so he leads almost like an uprising against those who are in there to bring justice, etc. And they steal the warden's, the major, whatever he is, his flag. They want to fly it upside down to let folk know there's a real crisis here. And on the way to do it, of course, he comes out with all of his regiments, point guns at Robert Redford, and he's demanding, give me my flag. And Robert Redford says, not your flag. And I like feel that way about the table. And we start banging all over it. I just want to say, it's not your table.
Oh, exactly.
And if, you know, maybe there's ways the church, we just need to get out of the way so folk can get to that table and model that, as my wife's saying and others, as you're saying, in a very resetting way, a rebooting way, that then that table extends in all parts of our lives.
Right.
I don't know, that really touched me. And I don't know if you want to say anything on that before we have a kind of a last word.
Well, just end with, you know, the host of every table is Jesus. I don't care whether it's your table or my table. That's what Cleopas at the Emmaus Road story, he got really quickly. I mean, it's amazing that he turned over the hosting of that table, and he didn't even know it was Jesus at the time, you know. And so every table that we sit at, even though you think it's, you know, whoever's household it is, well, this is mine. No, it's host of this. If you're a follower of Jesus, the host of that table is Jesus. But Jesus is recognized and known when. And it's really clear they did not recognize him. I mean, that's the whole question of the story. How did they fail to recognize him? You know, Cleopas and Mary, his husband and wife. And how did they fail? And then it said when Jesus was given the right to host the table, he took the bread, he blessed it, he broke it, and then he gave it to them. And it says, then they recognized him. When then? When they recognized them is when, as he pulled his hands out from under his toga and all that cloth, and for the first time they saw the wounds. And when they saw the wounds, they recognized him. And that's what happens around the table. When you show your wound, when you bear your wounds, when you tell wound stories and show those wounds, then people recognize Jesus, and now you're having real Jesus worship. And that's why the table is so sacred, because it enables us to bear our woundedness, to be a wounded people in need of Christ, and then we recognize Jesus and what he's doing in our midst. So bring back the table.
Oh, man, thank you for that. And I hope you know just the seeds you've planted, and Terry and I and our ministry and here in Cleveland, that through the Mosaics Network, we're kind of a teaching church and getting a prelude to the Revelation 7-9 table, every people, tribe, nation, and tongue. And we're getting them to that table as we can, but we're really feeling that God has pressed on us as we've been praying that, giving us that ministry of reconciliation. So you gave us the theology of the table as a vehicle to do that in the best way at. I mean, we can preach all the great sermons and my gosh, how many, workshops can we go to about teaching us about the ills of social evil or whatever, but getting us at that table, that's a foretaste of the heavenly banquet. I love what you did in there where, the image of heaven is that great feast. I think the Greek Orthodox talk about this feast that's taken place and, the best wine and people swinging from the chandeliers. And once in a while that breaks in to to the present. They called it Sunday morning. We wish it would always be that way, but then hell being that very lonely table where we're all
Yeah,
on ourselves. So
exactly.
thank you for that.
Jesus' ministry, Chip, Jesus' ministry begins with a table at the Cana story, the wedding feast. It begins with a table. His first miracle is around the table. His last supper is around the table. The whole framing of the Jesus story
Yeah.
is a table.
Yeah, and I should have known that until I read your book, obviously 2 years after you gave it to me. But I really had to be hit as a theologian to say, how much time and ministry did he spend at tables? I mean, just how much? And you articulated that. So thank you, man. It's so good to catch up and so good to hear these
Thank
words.
you.
Really.
Good to see you, Terry.
So-
Hope Terry.
And I hope you bless everybody here, and we'll get you to Cleveland soon. But
Okay.
more importantly, I got to get up your way, do some fishing.
Great salmon. All right.
All right. Love you, bro. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank
God
you.
bless. See you, everybody.
Bye-bye.